For generations, the relationship between Canada and the United States was more than just an alliance. It was a deep familial bond built on shared values and mutual respect. It was a story told in the easy crossings at countless border towns, where families had members on both sides and Saturday shopping trips were a common ritual. We were neighbors, partners, and friends, navigating the complexities of the world side by side. The 49th parallel felt less like a border and more like a shared backyard fence, a symbol of the world's longest undefended friendship, a testament to a partnership that seemed unshakable, one that had weathered global conflicts, economic downturns, and political shifts with a quiet, enduring strength that many other nations could only envy. This sense of easy familiarity was woven into the fabric of our daily lives, a constant and reassuring presence. Canadians vacationed in Florida and Arizona, while Americans flocked to Banff and Montreal. Our economies were so intricately linked that the prosperity of one was seen as intrinsically tied to the other. We cheered for each other's athletes when our own weren't in the running, and we mourned each other's tragedies as if they were our own. This was the bedrock of the relationship, a foundation of trust that allowed for frank discussions and disagreements, always with the underlying assumption that we were ultimately on the same team, working towards a common good for the people of North America. However, over the last few years, a chill has settled over this historic friendship, a cold front moving in from the south that has steadily eroded that foundational trust. The change began subtly, with accusations from Washington in 2023 that Canada was manipulating trade advantages, a narrative that felt foreign and jarring to most Canadians. This was followed by more aggressive actions, culminating in the unilateral withdrawal from the softwood lumber agreement in 2024, a move that sent shockwaves through communities across Canada, threatening the livelihoods of an estimated 280,000 people. The familiar dialogue of partnership was replaced by a more confrontational and unpredictable tone, leaving Canadians feeling bewildered and disrespected by their closest ally. The sense of being taken for granted has now hardened into a quiet resolve. The relationship, once defined by its warmth and predictability, is now marked by a growing distance and a strategic reassessment from Ottawa. An Angus Reid Institute poll starkly illustrates this shift, revealing that a full 34% of Canadians no longer view the United States as a reliable partner. This isn't just a fleeting political disagreement, it's a profound change in the national psyche, a reluctant acknowledgement that the unwritten rules of our long-standing friendship have been broken, perhaps irrevocably. The backyard fence now feels taller, and the gate that once swung open so freely is now being fitted with a lock. The economic partnership that once defined North America began to publicly fracture in early 2025. Without warning or negotiation, the United States imposed a severe new wave of tariffs on essential Canadian imports. Suddenly, bedrock Canadian industries found their products, from steel and paper to milk and wine, hit with an 18% tax at the border. This wasn't a negotiation tactic, it was a unilateral decree that upended decades of stable trade. The move was a direct blow to the Canadian economy, but more than that, it was a signal that the era of predictable, rules-based trade with our largest partner was over. The action was seen not as a policy dispute, but as a hostile act designed to cripple Canadian competitiveness. In response, Canada chose not to engage in loud rhetorical battles. Instead, Ottawa's reply was measured, strategic, and firm. The government implemented its own set of retaliatory tariffs targeting 56 specific American products. These were not random. They were carefully selected to maximize political pressure while minimizing harm to Canadian consumers where possible. Items like American beef, apples, eggs, and rice suddenly became more expensive on Canadian shelves. This was a clear message. Canada would not absorb these economic attacks passively. It was a move born of necessity, a quiet but powerful declaration that economic sovereignty would be defended with reciprocal action, dollar for dollar. The Canadian government didn't stop at tariffs. It also took the unprecedented step of suspending 3 major bilateral trade agreements valued at a combined $7.8 billion. Furthermore, Canada withdrew from the North American Agricultural Supply Chain Cooperation Program, a move that immediately caused delays at the border and led to the cancellation of long-standing contracts for American farmers. This was a structural dismantling of the mechanisms of cooperation. On June 26, 2025, Parliament passed Bill C-202, a law that legally prevents the government from lowering tariffs on dairy, poultry, or eggs in future trade talks, effectively tying its own hands to prove its resolve to the United States and the Canadian public. Adding another layer to its firm stance, Ottawa published a list of 27 prominent American companies that would lose their tax incentives and investment support in Canada, effective August 2025. This list included household names like Taco Bell, FedEx, and the financial giant Goldman Sachs, signaling that the consequences of this trade dispute would be felt in American corporate boardrooms. Canada's response was a multi-pronged strategy of economic pushback, a clear signal that the days of being a compliant junior partner were over. The message was that if the United States was going to change the rules, Canada would start playing an entirely new game. The consequences of this trade standoff are no longer abstract policy debates. They are tangible realities for Canadians every time they go to the grocery store. What began in Washington and Ottawa has now landed squarely in the shopping carts of families across the country. The price of everyday goods has become a stark indicator of our broken trade relationship. For instance, a carton of American milk, once a common purchase in many households, has seen its price surge from around $3.49 Canadian to over $5.20. This isn't just an inconvenience. For families on a tight budget, it is a significant financial strain that forces difficult choices between brands, products, and even meals. This economic pressure has sparked a quiet but powerful consumer movement. A recent survey by the Globe and Mail found that nearly half of all Canadian consumers are now consciously choosing to avoid American products, deliberately looking for the product of Canada label, or seeking alternatives from other countries. This shift is not just about price. It's a patriotic response, a grassroots expression of solidarity with Canadian producers. The numbers bear this out. In May 2025 alone, Canadian imports of American agricultural products plummeted by an astonishing 38%. The message from Canadian consumers is clear. If our partnership is not valued, our dollars will be spent elsewhere. The nation's largest retailers have responded to this change in consumer sentiment and the new economic realities. 4 of Canada's biggest grocery chains have publicly stated they are no longer prioritizing American suppliers, actively seeking out and promoting domestic alternatives or products from Europe and Asia. This is a fundamental rewiring of the continental supply chain. What was once a seamless flow of goods across the 49th parallel is now being rerouted. It is a monumental shift, as 1 in 3 Canadian businesses is now actively pursuing new trade strategies that pivot away from the United States, a market once considered indispensable to their success and survival. This evolving landscape reflects a deeper change in the Canadian mindset. It is a pragmatic adaptation to a new era of uncertainty. A study from McGill University found that 62% of Canadians between the ages of 30 and 55 believe the country must forge a more independent path free from its historical reliance on the United States market. The trade war has done more than just raise prices. It has awakened a sense of economic nationalism and a desire for self-reliance that will likely shape the country's economic and foreign policy for decades to come, fundamentally altering how Canadians see their place in the world and their relationship with their southern neighbor. The economic pain of this fractured relationship is not a one-way street. It's being felt deeply in American communities, often in ways that Washington's policymakers just didn't anticipate. In border cities like Buffalo, New York, retaliatory tariffs have actually caused the price of milk to rise by 60 cents, which hits household budgets directly. And honestly, the impact is even more pronounced in the construction industry. With Canada supplying over 45% of America's construction wood, U.S. tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber have driven up material costs by over 12%. This isn't just a number on a spreadsheet. These are real-world consequences, leading directly to the cancellation of 2 major housing projects in Ohio and Vermont. The fallout, though, extends into one of the most sensitive areas of American life healthcare. For years, over 2 million Americans, many of them seniors on fixed incomes, have relied on Canadian pharmacies for access to affordable prescription drugs. In a defensive move to protect their own supply, Canadian pharmacies began restricting sales to foreigners, and as a result, Sales to Americans plummeted by 42% in March 2025. This has created a genuine health crisis for so many who depended on lower Canadian prices for life-saving medications. The story of a senior in Maine who can no longer afford her insulin isn't a political talking point. It's a direct and painful consequence of this diplomatic breakdown. American businesses, especially those in states with strong trade ties to Canada, are also paying a heavy price. An Indiana-based packaging company, for example, recently lost its largest and most loyal customer, a major food processor in Ontario, to a competitor based in Finland. The Canadian buyer just couldn't rely on a supply chain that was subject to the whims of unpredictable tariffs. Job losses are now being reported in states like Wisconsin and Maine, where dairy farmers and lumber workers have seen their primary export market shrink dramatically. These aren't just statistics. They're shuttered businesses and unemployed workers caught in the crossfire of a trade war they never asked for. The belief that the US held all the leverage in this relationship is, well, being proven wrong. Canada remains a critical supplier of essential goods to the United States, providing over half of its aluminum and being its largest source of clean energy imports. This level of interdependency means that actions intended to punish Canada inevitably boomerang, creating unintended economic and social disruption at home. The architects of the tariff strategy may have underestimated both the resilience of the Canadian response and the intricate, delicate balance of the integrated North American economy. The pain being felt in American towns is a stark reminder that in a relationship this close, it's impossible to harm one side without inflicting wounds on the other. At its core, this profound rift isn't simply about trade statistics or tariffs on steel and dairy. It's really about the fundamental principles of respect and trust that have to underpin any healthy partnership. For too long, Canada was perceived by some in Washington as a compliant junior partner, a reliable neighbor that could be taken for granted without consequence. The unilateral actions, the cancelled agreements, and the abrasive rhetoric were seen by Canadians as a deep and painful betrayal of a century of friendship. The quiet, firm response from Ottawa isn't an act of anger, but a necessary act of self-respect, a signal that the relationship must be one of equals, or it will be no relationship at all. Faced with an unreliable partner to the south, Canada isn't waiting for a change of heart in Washington. It's actively and successfully forging its own path on the global stage. In a remarkable pivot, Canada's trade with the European Union surged by 23% in the first half of 2025 alone. At the same time, the government has signed 5 new trade agreements with dynamic, growing nations in the Indo-Pacific region. This is a deliberate and strategic diversification, a move to build a future where Canada's economic destiny isn't tethered to the political climate of a single nation, no matter how close a neighbor they once were. This strategic pivot is bolstered by Canada's surprising economic leverage. While diversifying its trade, Canada has also solidified its role as a key player in the American economy, but on its own terms. It has now surpassed China to become the #1 foreign investor in the US clean technology sector, a pretty powerful position in the economy of the future. Globally, Canada is now ranked as the second most attractive country for sustainable investments, drawing capital and talent from around the world. This just isn't a portrait of a country suffering in isolation, but of a nation confidently leveraging its strengths to build new, more stable alliances. The future of the Canada-US relationship remains uncertain. Maybe one day, the trust and mutual respect that once defined it can be rebuilt. But what is certain is that Canada has been fundamentally changed by this experience. The nation has been reminded of its own strength, its global appeal, and its capacity for self-reliance. From banks in Quebec and British Columbia exploring payment systems that bypass the US dollar, to businesses finding new markets in Asia, Canadians are building a more independent future. This is Canada's quiet declaration of independence, not a departure from an old friendship, but a step toward a new era of global engagement on its own terms.